What we really like is the session is planned to be quite informal for us to sort of explore this idea of inclusivity and how that intersects with marine spatial planning. So we'd really like it to be interactive. It's going to be interactive between ourselves because we've got very different sort of experiences and directions through which we sort of approach the idea of participation and inclusion within marine spatial planning, and we all come to marine spatial planning from very different disciplines and therefore activities. So our plan is to sort of explore the idea of inclusivity and what this means operationally with respect to marine spatial planning. So the questions we're going to be considering are things like how do we move towards a meaningful interpretation of inclusivity, where we're not simply harvesting data or looking for approval box ticking for plans that have already been made. So we're actually looking to develop plans that represent the sort of needs and wants of the people that will be sort of affected by them. Other questions that we'll touch on are, how do you define stakeholders? All of this, and it's important to highlight that consultation is not necessarily something that we've all been involved with as per what am I trying to say? That inclusion perhaps isn't our area of expertise. We're not professing to be experts in that field. We're going to touch on the topic from respect of our various work and how that sort of links to the ideas of inclusion and participation and what it means in the areas that we're working in. So in terms of structure, we'll start with a brief intervention from each of the panelists, around 3 minutes. We'll introduce ourselves and our work with respect to MSP and participation and inclusion. And then we'll move on to a discussion to explore the ideas that arise from our introductions. So we'd really welcome input from you guys, the audience. Our aim is for this to be inclusive and interactive. So please send through your comments in the chat, questions using the Q&A functionality. Both of them should be enabled. And then if you have something that you're particularly keen to contribute to the discussion, if you could raise your hand or indicate in the chat, then we might be able to give you permissions to join us to speak. So with that, I suppose I will start. I'll just briefly give you a little bit of an introduction to the One Ocean Hub. So all of us here are researchers on the One Ocean Hub, the UKRI One Ocean Hub. And it's an international programme of research for sustainable development, working to promote fair and inclusive decision-making for a healthy ocean, whereby people and the planet can flourish. Well, I won't introduce the others yet. I will just touch on my work. So I'm a research fellow based at the University of Plymouth in the UK. I'm working primarily on the hub. My research sits at the interface of knowledge production and use. So how information is used to make decisions, how policy, information and governance come together to make decision-making processes, and how we can make decisions relating to making marine natural resource use fair. So specifically as part of the One Ocean Hub, I've been looking at the intersection of sustainability with a focus on the SDGs and emerging blue economies, and also the development of a basis for applying the natural capital approach in areas beyond national jurisdiction, so ABNJ. So the latter of these topics really focuses on laying the foundations for marine spatial planning, so kind of preempting the need for MSP and use of ABNJ, as we can see that the interest is starting to intensify with the development of technologies and sort of desire for some of the resources out there. So inclusivity in ABNJ, which are waters outside of 200 nautical miles, so outside areas that countries have a national claim. But inclusivity in these areas is a challenging concept. an immediate description or assumption that you might often see sort of written alongside descriptions of consultation and or the kind of perceived stakeholders is that, you know, it's remote, and it is hardly anyone goes there, but therefore the number of stakeholders is assumed to be small, not stretching beyond those involved in high seas fishing and shipping. But however, if you start to think about issues of equity, which is required by UNCLOS, so the law of the sea, and large-scale processes, ecosystem services, then it becomes clear very quickly that stakeholders, or those possibly affected by decisions made on resource use in ABNJ, include many people that may be really, really distant from the activity. So you've got a really diffuse sort of filter for who might then be considered a stakeholder. So, for example, if we're talking about an activity that might impact carbon cycling or storage, such as fishing or potentially deep sea mining, then we could be looking at global impacts, largely affecting those most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. You know, so coastal communities and people that live on low-lying land or reliant on marine resources for food. Alternatively, if we consider the life cycle of some fish species, these could be affected by intensive industrial fishing undertaken in ABNJ. This intensive fishing may affect the fish available to small-scale fishers and populations or communities reliant on the fish arising from these small-scale industries for nutrients, which then becomes a health issue. So when you consider the need as set out by UNCLOS to manage ABNJ and its resources for the benefit of mankind, including future generations, it's when you consider questions of how do we make decisions that are fair when participating in these industries, needs advanced technology and huge investment. So perhaps those people that are most likely to be affected by the consequent impacts of on these large-scale processes, for example, aren't able to participate in extracting the immediate value from these resources. So thinking about these questions is really challenging when you look at areas beyond national jurisdiction. And it certainly makes the idea of kind of inclusion and fair inclusion sort of quite a challenging one to address if you want to do it sort of robustly. So my research considers how these big questions, which all add up to looking at a more complex definition of a value of a resource, so beyond market value, are embedded within decision making and management and marine spatial planning, and also looks at how you address questions of equity in management of these resources through marine spatial planning as a process. So what is needed to ensure that these questions are answered and inclusivity is realised. So in a nutshell, that's what sort of, I suppose, how my work touches on MSP. And I think, so now I'd like to quickly pass on to Kelly. Was it you next? I might have got that wrong. I think it's Kelly. So we're going to go through everybody and everyone's going to briefly introduce themselves, but please feel free to fire through questions and comments in the chat, and we'll try and make this as interactive as possible, but we will have a big chunk of time for chat at the end. So Kelly, I'll pass over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kelly Ortega. I'm a researcher at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and my background is on biology, and for the latest 5 years I've been working with ecosystem models to investigate the functioning and the management of marine ecosystems. So for those not familiar with ecosystem models are a representation of an ecosystem, and they work kind of like flight simulators to allow us to predict what will happen in the future in an ecosystem if, for instance, the temperature increases by 1 degree or 2 degrees. And we know that the ocean is impacted by many different stressors like climate change, overfishing, and pollution, among many others. And ecosystem models also allow us to evaluate the cumulative impacts of these different stressors. And they see how they interact in an ecosystem, because all of these stressors do not act in isolation. So one important thing about ecosystem models is that they help us evaluate cumulative impacts on an ecosystem. So interactions between climate change and fishing, for instance, and they also allow us to evaluate trade-offs. So for instance, when we have many different users with different objectives and goals, how we can try to find a compromise and a balance to make sure that all of the users feel that they are being included in a process. And this can help develop and also compare different scenarios. So in terms of marine spatial planning, ecosystem models have been used as decision support tools, and they have specifically been used in the stages 6 and 7 of marine spatial planning. So in defining and analyzing future conditions of an ecosystem, of an area that is being managed, and also in preparing and approving the marine spatial plan. So ecosystem models are important here because they can be used as a starting point for deliberation and for people to express what are their objectives are and what is that they foresee on the marine spatial, for the marine spatial plan. And the one thing with ecosystem models is that they normally require quite a lot of data for their construction. They are time consuming too, and they also require different types of knowledge that are sometimes are not already available. And all of this needs to be integrated into the planning process. So one of the recommendations to make ecosystem models more user-friendly and to allow different type of users to use these ecosystem models and to integrate it into planning has been to make the tools and the user interaction more friendly and to start developing these tools from the very beginning with different stakeholders. So some of the tools that have been applied or that have been created like this include, for instance, the Marine Spatial Planning Challenge 2050. So this is a computer simulation game that gives different stakeholders an idea of how the marine spatial planning works. So it's really interesting because you get this visual tool where you can decide what will happen if you put wind farm in certain area of the North or the Baltic Sea, because they've been mostly developed for the Northern Hemisphere. But I mean, they can be extended to many different areas. And they're very useful because it gives different types of users an idea of how marine spatial planning works and how they can be used even for people that is not involved for MSP. So in that way can increase collaboration and also participation. And can include different other stakeholders. So these simulation games have been linked to ecosystem models such as the EcoSpace model, and they allow you to test different marine spatial planning scenarios and see how the effect of a given wind farm will have in fish abundance or in distribution, or how will it affect the habitat of different species, and provide indicators that allow people and also planners to compare these alternative scenarios. And again, look at trade-offs and decide which could be the best scenario for the future. So the two messages I think I would like to send is that for ecosystem models and other decision support tools to be effective and marine spatial planning is that it's key to involve local communities from the very beginning, from the design of these tools. And also remember that local stakeholders are key to the project design and implementation process, because if the users are not included on the process, then we will have like lower compliance. And also to remember that collaboration from different stakeholders is key, and they need to work together in co-produce and design plans to achieve effective and inclusive marine spatial planning. Thank you, Holly. I'm not sure who is next. I think maybe Michelle.
Thanks, Kelly.
Sorry, everyone, just making sure I had not muted myself. Hello, everybody. My name is Michelle Devlin, and I'm an ecological scientist, and I work with CFAS, which is the Centre for the Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science in the UK. And I am the science lead of environment and people, so a main part of my job is to explore the interaction between marine environment and people. A lot of my work looks to, I work on UK funded programs where a main component is to work alongside environmental ministries, looking to explore how policy decisions can help prioritise positive actions in coastal and ocean environment. I have my science focus is on water quality, particularly on coastal water quality and coastal habitats. Also looking at how water quality affects coastal habitats and also human health issues and sort of larger scale environmental problems. Over the past few years, one of my jobs at CFAS is to lead on the Commonwealth Marine Economies program in the Pacific, which was a UK funded program to bring science work and science funded work into the Pacific and Caribbean SIDS on priorities and knowledge gaps that were identified with the national countries, each country. This work and a lot of my previous Australian Pacific research has provided many years in working in very remote, very beautiful, but very challenging places where the idea of marine spatial planning and how to develop marine spatial planning has been a very major component and sometimes a very tricky thing to try to solve. Thinking about this before I was coming onto this board, and I've been thinking about a lot of the conversations I've had with my other co-panelists, and I think it's difficult to think about inclusivity in marine conservation without really thinking about longer term interactions. So it's very easy, and all of us probably have done somewhat being part of the solution, where we go in and there's a really good research program. But I think the solution really does require partnerships and shared goals, both big and small. This doesn't always fit in well with science funding or government funding cycles. There's always recognition of the environmental problem and how funding can be found, but it's often for a very set amount of time, 3 or 4 years. And even the most inclusive climate financing can still be restricted to a 5 or 6 year cycle. However, many of the conservation issues that we face around the world can take years or decades to resolve. It's taken decades to make them, and it will take decades to resolve them. And so we have to try to find these solutions around these short-term funding cycles. Not always easy, but I think engagement, training, partnerships, and inclusion are essential components in this pathway. And we have to think about very innovative ways to extend short-term projects into long-term solutions. And it can only be done with active engagement with local communities, and marine spatial planning offers many tools to be able to do this. We can often start with a research program or project, but we can end with actively involved individuals who, with the right support, can continue to fight for marine conservation long after the funding cycles have ended or changed. It's much better to continue to fund long-term engagement and solutions, but that's not always the reality. So active inclusion can help progress this work well beyond the initial program. Training, technology, and time are all part of this process, and we need to embed this in the marine spatial planning for marine conservation. I also think through the work and my experiences that active change or impact can be achieved through engagement with national governments, but change in terms of working with the ministries, so not just local communities, but directly with the ministries. Changes in behaviour and positive outcomes for environment are much more tangible and realistic if supported by governments and environmental ministries and environmental law. So working with the ministries, training, monitoring, assessment and policy can have very long-term positive outcomes. I think it's not just enough to look to change behaviour, but to be able to recognise and chart, assess and report how environmental issues can change over time. It is really important to know how change in behaviour can lead to a positive outcome in the environment. So, and if there's been a government intervention, how well has it worked? So, and this is a lot with marine spatial planning and MPAs, there's always a need to report and assess what that long-term change is. And it can be something as simple as an upgrade in a sewage treatment plant or wetland restorations or full coral reef MPA. But we need to work with communities and governments through the marine spatial planning process, and we'll then to know what the impact is and how the government intervention can lead to more positive outcomes. So I think for me, it's that marine spatial planning requires everyone to be involved, but it really is, it's a long-term solution, and we really must think of ways to stay involved and to embed changes in those long-term solutions. Thank you. I don't know who I'm handing over to now.
No, we'll hand over to Kirsty, I think, now. Thanks so much, Michelle. That's really interesting. Lovely to hear your reflections on this and all your experience. I certainly have lots of questions. Kirsty, yeah, if you'd like to hop in.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very thought-provoking. Thanks, it's nice to be here with everyone today. So I'm Kirsty McQuaid. I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Plymouth and at the South African National Biodiversity Institute. I'm a deep sea ecologist, so I approach marine spatial planning from an environmental and a kind of biological perspective. And I also work on habitat mapping, which is one of the key products that feeds into marine spatial planning. So quite kind of, I guess, similar to Kelly in a way, very focused on the production of inputs for MSP planning. And so I guess the way I can contribute to this conversation is thinking about how we can ensure that the information that feeds into MSP on the environment is encompassing of all the forms of knowledge available and not just those that are traditionally used. So marine habitat maps, if you don't know, provide information on where different habitats and different species are located, and this can then be used by planners to get some kind of idea about what areas might need more protection than others. And this is obviously only one of the forms of information or data that feeds into MSP. You'd obviously have things like priority areas for oil and gas or fishing or tourism or whatever sector it might be. But these maps are generally generated by natural scientists and by oceanographers. And so they contain information or data that's collected by taking measurements of the seafloor or the water column, using scientific equipment, using videos, using photographs, but it doesn't normally include information or knowledge from other sources, so like local or traditional knowledge. And so this means that where there's important information about the natural ecosystems that's held by these other forms of knowledge, this can be lost in the process. And so I guess my key point or thing to think about is what mechanisms and what pathways are there for us to include these other forms of knowledge into the production of these tools that feed into MSP on the environment, and not just in a kind of retrospective stakeholder consultation like review stage, but more in the production, so the co-production of these products in that initial production phase. And so an example of how this has been done is in the Maldives. There's a project run by the Blue Marine Foundation, which is a British charity. And they've done some work with local fishermen where they've designed this app whereby the small-scale fishermen can draw on a map, on digital format, draw areas that they know are ecologically important. So like important spawning ground for a commercially valuable fish or something. And then these maps have fed into the decision-making process about what areas are maybe a priority for some kind of management action. So yeah, I'll leave it there, short and sweet. But I just invite the audience to reflect on how, what mechanisms and what pathways are there, potential pathways to include these other forms of knowledge, non-scientific knowledge that's ordinarily used in producing maps into MSP, this knowledge on the environment, kind of in the data collection and the analysis and the synthesis phase, rather than in the stakeholder consultation phase, which occurs later on. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you. So now I guess we'll just move on to our final intervention from Denning. And he can give you a brief introduction to his work now.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in your presence today. I'm a researcher with Nelson Mandela University. My area of specialization is the law of the sea. And I am presently hosted by the South African Research Chair in the Law of the Sea and Development in Africa. So we are talking about MSP and how it could contribute to inclusion and the desired outcome of sustainable development from all stakeholders within the marine environment. So before I get into the South African perspective on this, the legal perspective on this, it is clear that from an international point of view, the conservation of the marine environment has been at the heart of legal development over the years. And this is a trend which South Africa also hopes to continue. And the departing point with regard to South Africa would be the Constitution of South Africa, the relationship between the environment as a whole and the supreme legal framework of the state. Because for any major development to occur, and at least development that impacts on the livelihoods of the communities that depend on them, there needs to be a regulatory regime that protects the rights of the communities that are dependent on, as in this case, marine resources. So the departing point, which is very significant, is the South African Constitution, which makes the South African Constitution provides an environmental right. So it would not be a privilege to have a marine environment on which the local communities can rely on. It is a right that is protected by law and primarily the Constitution. And the way this all plays out is the Constitution creates an obligation on the state. So that is the national executive to ensure that there's the development of legal provisions or legal instruments that would ensure that the people's environmental right and their environment is protected not only for present, but for future generations. What this means is that there is not only a legal obligation to ensure that the local communities enjoy the environment they're exposed to now, but their enjoyment of the resources of the environment today should not deprive future generations of South Africans to enjoy the resources of the same environment. So flowing from this constitutional obligation to conserve and to protect the environment, South Africa has recently developed Marine Spatial Planning Law. So the Marine Spatial Planning Act, the act just recently came into effect in April 2021. And as far as I am aware of, it would be the first comprehensive marine spatial planning law within Africa. So focusing now on the Marine Spatial Planning Act, how does this act promote inclusion of all stakeholders, local communities in the enjoyment of marine resources? So we are all aware that the primary goal of MSP is to reconcile the competing uses of the marine environment so that the use of the environment by one sector or one community doesn't adversely impact uses by other sectors or communities. So the way the MSP, the Marine Spatial Planning Law in South Africa, aims to reconcile competing uses and to conserve the marine environment for present and future generations is that primarily it makes its provisions to be binding across South Africa as a whole, and all organs of state must comply with its provisions. And it goes beyond just making its application comprehensive throughout South Africa. It also makes provision that every permit, every authorization, every right to exploitation or use of the marine environment within South Africa must be consistent with marine area plans that would be established in terms of this law. So what it's trying to do is, because the environmental, the legal environmental framework in South Africa is more or less fragmented with various instruments regulating the various sectors, the Marine Spatial Planning Act aims to reconcile all of the various sectors to bring them into an agreement and promote consultation, promote the inclusion of knowledge from all sectors before the development of marine area plans in South Africa. And the reason for doing this, as I'm sure I've already mentioned before, is to promote sustainability in the exploitation of South Africa's marine resources. And in doing this, I was listening to everyone else present, and I took note of requirements for different methods of research, for inclusion, for the right information, to be fed to the decision-making makers, to the decision-making leaders, but also there needs to be a voice from the local communities, those that are immediately affected by activity within the marine area. This is something of grave concern, especially for South Africa, because 30% of South Africa's population lives within close proximity to its coast. And a significant portion of these people are reliant on marine resources as a primary source of livelihood. So it stands to reason that because of the weight of the Marine Spatial Planning Law, because of the impact that the establishment of marine area plans will have, local communities and all stakeholders need to be consulted. There needs to be a legal process that allows them to bring their voice to the determination of marine area plans so that they all have access, they can all enjoy the resources, and their involvement and their enjoyment of these resources does not jeopardize the future for other South Africans. So in order to achieve this, Marine Spatial Planning Law in South Africa makes room for the establishment of a knowledge and information system. This is a very important aspect of this law, because the knowledge of an information system is designed to house all relevant information from all sector departments, especially those departments that are directly involved with activity within the marine environment. And this information is not limited to up-to-date scientific knowledge, but for those of you who take the time to engage with this legal instrument, you would notice that the organ or the department charged with developing the marine area plans has an obligation not only to take into account the information housed with the knowledge and information system, but they also have to take into account considerations of the local communities, representative societies as well. So the law goes a long way to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to contribute to the decision-making process, and it does this by enshrining an obligation on the Minister of Environment to trigger consultation processes as part of the marine spatial planning process. So what it entails is that all sector departments, especially those with direct impact or with immediate interest in the marine environment, they have an obligation to consult with one another. And beyond that, each sector department must, there's a term used, it doesn't come to mind now, they must consult all their stakeholders. So not only do they need to feed the Knowledge and Information Center, they also have to consult with one another. So the sector departments must talk with one another so that their activities do not conflict. But they must also consult all of their stakeholders. So it trickles down to the average Joe on the street who would be impacted. There needs to be, or there has to be a structure wherein they consult with the local communities and other stakeholders, and all this information is then fed up to the decision-making institutions established by the Marine Spatial Planning Law. But what really stands out to me with regard to the consultation is there is no clear definition of what this consultation should entail. So it is mentioned there, but there is no breakout on, okay, this is what the consultation should look like. Because we understand that while it's important to have a legal obligation to consult the stakeholders, consultation needs to be flexible because of the various stakeholders that are involved and the communities that need to be involved. Not everyone has the same access to the more advanced information systems we have now. For example, we are consulting with one another and we're doing it via the internet. But I believe, and it stands to reason, that more local communities, some who have been victim of, deprived of various things in the past, including access to education, amongst other things, there would need to be a specific consultative strategy for these communities to ensure that in the development of marine area plans, their voices are taken into account, and that the outcome of the establishment of marine spatial plans does not put them in a position of further disadvantage. With that being said, I think I've managed to summarize the crux of South Africa's legal development to ensure inclusion in MSP with the aim of sustainable development. However, I think it would be important to find out how the various research presented here today or introduced here today, how the information you produce, how your findings are fed to the significant sectors that inform the decision makers when it comes to the establishment of marine spatial plans. So I would like to pause there for now and give us an opportunity to reflect on this and to engage in questions. Personally, I would just like to know how you think or how you think the law could evolve even further to include the concerns you have and to promote sustainable use of the ocean environment in general. Thank you.
Thanks, Denning. That's given us a lot to think about. I suppose my initial reflections, if I jump in here and allow you guys to jump in, and bear in mind, I just should also highlight that we know Kelly has to unfortunately dash off in about 15 minutes. So Kelly, please jump in, and if anyone has any questions for Kelly, then please send them to her now or send them to us now so she has a chance to answer them. But I think my reflections on all of the talks that we've just heard now is that it's interesting to consider sort of that there are these legal hooks and requirements for consultation. But if you reflect, I suppose, on what Michelle was speaking about and her experiences, is that there is perhaps a gap between legal requirements for consultation and meaningful participation and inclusion. And it seems to me that a lot of those gaps relate to things like trust and understanding actually what is needed. And so I suppose I'm interested to explore, well, what this means for the inclusion of data and how that sort of undertaken, or the consultation processes that relate to that, whether that's sort of captured by this legal requirement for consultation, but also this idea of what's needed for us to actually understand what participation should look like for it to be inclusive, and for this consultation to actually be meaningful, to lead to plans that are sort of representative and meet the needs of people. So I don't know if anyone else has anything that they'd like to reflect on in that regard. Michelle?
That was excellent to hear, everybody, and I've written so many notes, and Denning, thank you very much. I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts. I was very interested when you're talking about consultation, and I think it's one of the challenges actually, because even talking about law and legal frameworks is probably already very difficult terminologies for many of the people who would be impacted by the law itself, either a good or bad law. And I think so you did note that there is no clear definition of consultation. And I think we'd all agree that sometimes the people most impacted by the environmental issues or a lack of marine spatial planning or MPA or any of those things are people who are nowhere near consultation to the legal frameworks. And I think that we have to think very carefully, and I'd be really interested in going back to the other panelists, how do we ensure inclusion in that consultation process? Law is I know, obviously talking about people in law, but it is sometimes a very hard concept, and there is a lot of complex interactions, complex wording, terminology, and I think so for somebody, living in a community directly affected by, say, a sewage treatment plant or water quality, how do they become involved in the consultation? And I think one of the solutions is obviously really strong representation, that the people in the ministries and the NGOs guiding the ministries do need to represent those communities, and they do need to understand law and it's not really fair to expect individuals in a community to understand the legal framework. But I'd be really interested to hear other people's thoughts on that.
Well, before anyone else jumps in, thank you for that, Michelle. And as you spoke, I was just thinking now that the NGOs play a significant role with awareness. And it's a role which I think needs to be promoted. Because, for example, within South Africa, when there is a proposed law, as far as I know, there is some room made for consultation or to inform the public at least of what is going on. But again, the means used to inform the public, I think in itself is very exclusive. A majority of the people directly affected by human interaction, especially interaction by huge corporates within the marine environment, are very unlikely to get these notices calling for their input. So in a way, I just wish to throw it in there. We should also think of means of not only improving legal provisions, but granting NGOs a more significant voice and role to bridge the distance between the people directly impacted and the lawmakers. There's a hand up. That's my cue to pause. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's not. It was me just wanting to say that I know that some people find NGOs' involvement extremely problematic, because I know that their sort of ability to represent people can be quite flawed, especially large environmental NGOs that obviously have huge clout and huge value in the broad spectrum of things and how things work. But in these negotiating spaces, they don't always necessarily represent everybody. So I was just wondering whether perhaps Kelly and Kirsty might like to reflect on whether actually the process of data gathering to form that sort of baseline for marine spatial plans, whether you think that could actually sort of be a way to develop capacity for people to engage in awareness. Maybe this is sort of another level at which, where you start at the very bottom, where you look at and you're trying to understand who is affected and how people are related. But so I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, to perhaps experience. I know both of you have worked in this area.
If it's okay, I'm gonna go first, Kirsty. In my opinion, I fully agree. I think awareness is needed, and awareness is related to capacity. But on my point of view, I believe that it should be driven mostly by government. I think it's a lot of the work on awareness is actually driven, for instance, in South Africa. That's where I'm based and where my experience comes from. Is a lot of awareness is driven by actual researchers and scientists, and especially for certain groups, especially people that don't have access to information, like Denny was mentioning. Government hasn't really done such a great job for certain groups to engage and actually create awareness. I mean, sometimes some of the roadshop informations that the government provides are like located in areas that are very far for people to access, or happen during the week, so people is working and they cannot attend. So I think awareness is one point to start, and I think that should start from the very, very beginning. And in terms of the data collection process, I believe that that's one way where people could be integrated from the beginning, and using people's knowledge actually to incorporate into, for instance, ecosystem models. As I was mentioning, they're very data intensive. They require a lot of data. And some of this data is sometimes not available, but actually by talking to people, you can use their knowledge and integrate those onto models, and also develop scenarios that are relevant to people. So you work with them instead of coming with your preconceived ideas of what things will look like on the future. You discuss with people, and then you develop or co-develop these scenarios that are relevant to the actual users. And then I feel that by doing that, you can actually get a more effective implementation of the plan. and a product that it's people see as their own because they have developed these scenarios. And I hope I mentioned that on my introduction, but I feel that if we combine awareness with like visual tools, for instance, for decision support tools that can engage people and can again create awareness of what the process is, that will certainly help to gather to get their buy-in on the process, and also to gather information to be used on the process and that can be used eventually in decision making. That's all what I have to say for this one.
And have you had NGOs, sort of NGOs involved in helping you with this? Have NGOs been instrumental in helping you gather this data or undertake those processes?
For what being involved so far, I have not worked directly with NGOs, and for other type of work on major fisheries, we have worked with NGOs, and also for climate change, for instance, applications on small scale fisheries, for instance, with WWF in South Africa. But for the work that I'm doing using ecosystem models for marine spatial planning, we have not yet engaged with NGOs.
I'll just add to what Kelly said when Denning, you were talking about reaching inclusivity in the consultation phase and reaching the people who aren't necessarily included. And I think that's such an important point in terms of possible ways that the law could help to make MSP more inclusive, as the types of like the newspapers that they have to advertise in to say we're opening the public consultation phase, we're holding this information session, whatever it is, what newspapers are being chosen, what radio stations is it, where are they advertising this information? I think that's such an important point. But it also made me think about how do we identify or locate, for want of a better word, these other experts. So in this instance, like in marine science or the marine environmental understanding of natural ecosystems, how do we identify these other experts, these people with considerable knowledge about the environment that could be included in the production of input information rather than in the stakeholder consultation phase? How do you identify them, and does there need to be a legal requirement to identify, or how in the law is expert defined? Because I'm sure they talk about, consulting experts for whatever it might be. How is that defined in a way that's not just traditional science, academic, or whatever it might be? So yeah, that was the one thought. And then what else was it? Oh no, just Holly, or maybe Michelle, when you were talking about building capacity I suppose that's another thing you would need to think about, is identifying these people with, to be included in the process, but also building capacity in the sense of how to engage with these processes so that people with this other knowledge know how to engage with MSP processes. I think even as scientists or whoever is traditionally involved, it's even hard to understand sometimes how to engage in these processes. So just in terms of thinking about how you can draw in other experts and build capacity so that they know how to engage if they're interested in engaging in these processes.
Yeah, I fully agree, Kirsty. I think the idea of capacity building, I think, is quite, it's really important, but it's also quite a nebulous one, because I think you can think that capacity building just needs to happen at the bottom, but actually it probably needs to happen all the way up to make sure that you can. And I think actually, Michelle, you touched on this in one of your in your intervention, where you were talking about the need for training, technology, and time, and also assessments, and how that's embedded within sort of a policy level. Is how do people know how to engage everybody? Do people know how to be inclusive? I'm just not sure. I'm not sure that there is that definition that exists, but I don't know whether, Michelle, you could touch a bit more on your experience in relation to capacity building and things like this.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think we're all saying the right things, because I think even with the NGO question, they're very important NGOs, but again, you need participation from lots of NGOs, so lots of different communities and people and the environment are all represented, and it does take experience to understand the consultation process and what's needed. And I mean, I'm sure we've all been involved with, I think, working in some of the areas around the world where you have to sort of fill in some proposal, and it's incredibly convoluted, 30, 40 pages and all online, and you think, well, how is that? Is not easy for people to participate in that. And I think, but I have been lucky enough, I think, because of the government to government type projects that I've worked on, is that a lot of our work is actually working directly within the ministries themselves. So I've done so in Kiribati and Vanuatu and Solomons, and there's people doing amazing stuff. There might be like 3 people in the entire environment ministry who are trying to make informed decisions about a lot of activities. And so obviously you can't solve it all, but I think this again comes back to time, getting in and working with people. And legal frameworks, what Dan was saying, is really important, because a lot of environment ministries, I think from my experience, understand the law, obviously the law, and there's very big frameworks, but for them to be able to go, right, if we do some monitoring here and water quality and it fails a threshold, what do we do? Do we close the beaches? Do we go back to the sewage treatment plant? Does that affect the coral reef? Does it affect tourism? And so it's not enough just to know there's an impact, not enough just to know that they shouldn't be there. There has to be a process of intervention. It has to be a process where the ministry's right. So we're going to close the beach down for 2 weeks. We're going to do high frequency sampling. We're going to actually look at where the source of the issue is. And there's a series of steps. And then there's environmental legislation in which they can frame this. And I think this is the thing that takes time. And I think that's where we need to be involved. Well, with all the other things as well, but I think this also needs to be included. It's particularly important when considering the legal framework and how to actually help instigate what's in that legal framework. I won't say anymore. Sorry.
No, thanks, Michelle. That's really interesting. I'm just struggling a bit here because of all our questions are coming in as anonymous, so we can't see who's asking our questions. But there's a question here, and I thought I'd touch on it. Kelly, do you have something you'd like to answer on this question in relation to the parameters for exploring inclusiveness, or was this do you need to run?
I just want to answer this one because I was typing and I will run after that. I was thinking of gender indicators. I feel that looking at like gender balance, for instance, on MSP processes is something really important, and it's something that's been highlighted a lot, for instance, on climate adaptation, that when meetings are held, for instance, only men or mostly men that attend from communities to these meetings, and there's not much participation from females. And I mean, it's been proven, I think, in many different aspects that females and girls, females are like little girls are the ones that are like most affected when there's issues like related to climate or other issues with poverty. And I also feel that having a diverse group of stakeholders could also help, would be a parameter that could be seen, and ensuring that when those stakeholder analyses are made, that all of the less powerful stakeholders are also included in the process, not just like the most powerful ones. So in my experience, I will consider those the parameters that should be ticked in order to start considering or improving inclusiveness on MSP.
And have you got to leave now, Kelly? I'm just
yes, unfortunately, I have.
Well, thanks so much, Kelly, for joining us.
No, thank you guys for a really great panel, and for everyone that attended. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Michelle, have you, in any of the projects you've worked on, have they has inclusivity or participation been appraised or evaluated?
Yes. I think most of the, again, government to government, there is a strong metric or an assessment of inclusion, gender balance doesn't always work. None of it, I mean, obviously, I think if there's one thing we take away from all of these conversations is there's a whole mix of tools and activities to do, to include, to have inclusion, but we definitely get that asked of us, and I think it's just experience as well in the end. And I think it was Christy or yourself, if you don't have all the stakeholders involved at the beginning, when you're building the program, if it's a research program or doing monitoring, you don't have them all, include them along the way. And obviously you don't always know who all the stakeholders are at the start. That does come with experience as well when you're there and working alongside people. You have to have them all involved, and that's your biggest chance of success and change, is that everybody, even if they're not that sure or slightly against it, not all the NGOs are going, as you said before, Holly, some large conservation NGOs might be looking for something very different from a small community, but I think eventually there's always a place where everyone can meet. And I keep coming back to that, it takes time. It takes time, and I think that's sometimes the one thing that's not given to us is time. It's here's a project, it's 4 years, it's funded, and that's what I said. So we've learned to try to have really innovative ways to stay interactive and make friends, stay engaged. A lot of that has to come from the individual themselves, and to try to, even if they are short-term funds, it's a long-term solution. And it's a glib thing, I know, but I think that's where we've got to aim for.
I think this idea of trust building as well, that actually supports
so important.
And Tanya mentioned that social class would be an important parameter, which again is probably quite difficult to capture robustly, but I'd imagine that it is pretty important. So Denning, do you have any reflections in terms of whether any of these sorts of concerns or these sort of factors are captured by the law in South Africa in terms of consultation?
Thank you for that question, Holly. And what comes immediately to my mind is there are certain issues that should not be controlled by the law. That is, in the sense, the law is not in a position to force people to provide input or to provide their point of view with regard to developments of the environment, even if these developments affect them directly. And when I think of social classes involved, in South Africa, I would think of the underprivileged communities. There are so many aspects that influence reactions from these communities that are beyond the ambit of the law. If we think about it in practical terms, and just from observation now, when people are poor, they are very easily influenced. So it brings in the question also of, are NGOs the solution? Because who knows what information is fed to the people and in exchange for what? So far, the law, I think, has been successful as creating a platform that welcomes everyone to be involved, but there needs to be a move far beyond normative progress to substantive progress. And that would require a change in the attitude of the people generally. And that is not something I am convinced the law is able to do. There has to be interventions from the state with regard to other sectors, social security, amongst other things. And depending on improvements in other aspects of the lives of the local communities and all stakeholders involved, there should be a marked increase. There should be improvement in involvement in consultative processes. So the law in itself is not able to be the fix-all solution. There has to be further political willingness to improve livelihoods. And I think a direct impact would be increased participation, voluntary participation, and interest in environmental conservation. Yeah.
Thanks, Denning. I mean, from a selfish perspective, and thinking about what we've been talking about is, how do we do this for ABNJ? You know, how do we bring people along from the very beginning? You know, when we're talking about, you know, fundamental rights, I noticed that Tanya again mentions about, you know, that highlights the importance of basic needs. If we're talking about, you know, some of the ecosystem services that ABNJ provide, are totally related to basic needs, fundamental needs, and fundamental human rights, really. But how do you engage people in this process when we don't even really know how ecosystem services are provided out there and what impacts them? Any ideas? It'd be interesting to understand a bit more what people think about that.
I agree with you, Holly. It's already very complicated with areas within national jurisdiction. So if you go beyond the 200 nautical mile, in some cases, as you mentioned, it even gets more difficult to have the local communities involved. Because firstly, how much knowledge, if any, do they have? I know there is some knowledge out there, but we need to be able to trace what this knowledge is and how accurate it is. And again, interest, how do we provoke interest so that communities want to speak up for their livelihoods? It would be a little bit presumptuous to think we know what's best for them. They need to be actively involved in the process one way or the other. And I think that's something we need to think about and find meaningful ways of promoting such inclusion. See a hand up, so thank you.
Thanks. I didn't actually have an answer. I don't think anyone does. But that was the exact question I wanted to pose to you, actually, Holly, was what you've just said is, how on earth do we do this for ABNJ? And I think, well, firstly, I think it just highlights why what you are doing is actually so important and how complex it is, because we've had discussions about this and like trying to link ecosystem services on a global scale or whatever it might be that are provided in ABNJ, and how do you link them to communities within a state or nation or whatever it might be. And through One Ocean Hub, some of the stuff I'm looking at with some law students is also about like how, by context of seabed mining, but how seabed mining will then have climate change impacts. And so then, and that will obviously affect people on a global scale. And how do you bring them into the consultation that's currently happening on the seabed mining regulations in areas beyond national jurisdiction? And I really don't know how you do that, but it also made me think about, even within a national context, as soon as you move into deeper waters, again, people will have much less knowledge of those areas than, for example, like coastal waters. So maybe subsistence fishing or whatever it might be that's happening in much shallower waters. People have much better knowledge of coastal waters than they do of very deep offshore waters. I mean, even as scientists, we know way less about the deeper waters. And so, yeah, I was just thinking about how do we include people and how do we include all of the stakeholders, because even activities that might be happening in offshore waters obviously will affect people in inshore waters and coastal communities and things, and how do we reconcile that, I guess? And I don't have an answer. But yeah, it's just something I was reflecting on.
Yeah, Danny, I don't think there is an answer at the moment, because I think those links are really there are many of them and they're diffuse. But at the moment we're heavily reliant on NGOs actually as observers to some of these processes, and as representation of civil society. But as we've seen in the chat, you know, are civil society organisations observers? Are there enough of them? Probably not. I mean, probably you've got a lot of strong environmental organisations or NGOs represented as observers, but I'm not sure beyond that whether even NGOs perhaps in that civil space are big enough, because how do you, I'm just not sure who that would be, because if you're talking about a specific community, not each of them has a nice NGO that's well funded enough to be able to attend these meetings. So I'm just not sure. Denning, did you want to touch on this?
Yeah, I was going to say, beyond the NGOs, we always have to remember that the primary actors on the international scene are the states. So it's important that sovereign states take the responsibility to initiate social awareness campaigns that involve the uses of the marine environment as well. We've seen social campaigns based on various issues, but I'm yet to see any that aims to provoke an awareness of the uses of the ocean space, its significance to the local communities. That is a way to go. And the reason why it is right, I think, to place the primary responsibility on the state, and they should seize this opportunity to lead well, is because at the end of the day, they are the decision makers on the international scene. Because as you mentioned, areas beyond national jurisdiction, it would be harder for an NGO or local communities, if they even have access to the negotiations, to be influential enough. So sovereign states need to take more of this into account and to determine how it would help their local communities to be more aware of the resources further away from their coast, as well as those within the coast, and to inform them of their rights with regard to access of these resources and how such access would influence their livelihoods going forward. So NGOs have a role to play, no doubt, but states have a really more significant role to play with promoting inclusivity and raising awareness. South Africa is doing well so far, but there is still much work to be done. Thank you.
Holly, can I add to that? Actually, thinking about that big question in offshore areas, interestingly, I don't think coastal areas have, you know, that's been very sorted at all. And I think there's almost like the opposite effect, that because it's so close and it's so day to day for everybody, the importance of some of those coastal resources or coastal resilience isn't valued as much as it should be. But that's something we can work through with the right, you know, with communities. Offshore areas, big tracts of water, historically, no one's been able to see other than the people that are there. And what's changing is what was mentioned before, again, is data and technology and satellites and Earth observations. And suddenly it's very easy to see pretty much what everyone's doing on the open seas. And I think governments embracing this type of technology, which actually there's a lot of work going on to make this very accessible to all the countries, so sovereign states. And I think this is a game changer for how we manage offshore areas, because suddenly what you can see on a day-to-day basis helps you make decisions on huge tracts of water that are very difficult to manage. And so I think with that, and again, embedded in a legal framework, because I completely agree that some of these the big open waters are very difficult to manage legally, particularly if there's conflicting responsibilities. But I think that the knowledge you get from technology now means we are understanding the full extent of the impacts. And it's quite scary, really. And I think that encourages people to go, we've got to do more. And again, coming back to countries to put in the legal frameworks to be able to do more. So I think satellites, Earth observation, that's a game changer. And I think big modeling technology gives us information on a scale we've never had before.
Kirsty, have you got your hand up? You have got your hand up, but do you want to answer? No. I think that's a really interesting point. And there has Sinead has just asked a question in the chat, but before I just quickly go to that, because I think we've got time for a couple of points. I suppose for me, and this is personal reflection, it's interesting that we talk about reliance on the states to provide, to sort of promote awareness and also control, in a way, take ownership of that participation and inclusion. And I think that's probably very right. But it's also, they possibly don't have that good a track record so far. And so, you know, without civil oversight and that access for pressure to be put on states to force them to do this, I'm just wondering what's the mechanism? And I think probably, if you look at Michelle, Kirsty, you know, I know Kirsty, your work in creating these big models is also doing this. If you can start to look and show these links between what's out there, what's happening, and then how that what these risks are, which I suppose is also hopefully what I'm trying to work on myself, is perhaps that's the beginnings, you know, the basis to start to create that narrative to help people understand their connection to the to areas beyond national jurisdiction and the ocean more broadly. And I know there's other work in the hub, as an anonymous participant has outlined in the chat, that, you know, under the hub we are also exploring, you know, how art-based forms of research can demonstrate these links and make people more aware of the different types of links that people have with different aspects and different values of the ocean. I expect that was maybe Elisa or Bernie, who I did see in there at some point. But I'll just move on now, because I could talk about this for a long time, because I know it's complicated. But Sinead has asked the question here in the Q&A, just asking for our views on consultative participatory methods, such as citizen assemblies and other examples of deliberative democracy that may create time and space for knowledge sharing and capacity building, such as discussions around ecosystem services, but ultimately involve a smaller amount of people compared to other consultation processes, such as open events or online processes. And I'd like to open that up to the rest of the panel, but I think this is a really interesting point and certainly something that I've spoken about with colleagues before. But before I selfishly waffle on, does anyone else on the panel have any thoughts on that? Denny?
Okay, sorry about that. Well, the first point I would say is, obviously I'm speaking within the framework of South Africa's legal framework. It is a requirement, it is a constitutional requirement that the principle of participatory democracy be included in the development of any law in South Africa. So this constitutional obligation also finds a voice in South Africa's marine spatial planning law. So not only does the Marine Spatial Planning Act provide for consultation with stakeholders recognized organizations, it also opens up consultation to the general public as well. So I don't think the provision contains a limit to the number of people or the size of a group that wants to make a representation based on a proposed legal instrument. It opens it up to everyone, basically. And the main issue that I raised is access to this information to begin with. The platforms used to disseminate information that the public is invited to react to would be the problem, and not necessarily the size of a group that is able to participate or to respond to an open call for input on the proposed law of sorts. Yeah. That's it for me.
And from my perspective, I wonder whether citizen assemblies, I'm not quite sure whether on a global scale you could ever and I haven't looked at this in detail, but I'm not sure, and perhaps if anyone else has any thoughts on this, they can write in the chat, but I'm not sure on a global scale whether you could undertake such a process sort of effectively and sort of appropriately. But perhaps individual states and how they engage on issues of resource use in ABNJ, and especially how states choose to progress or engage in how industries develop and progress, perhaps things like deep sea mining or intensification of fishing or other things that take place out there, that perhaps at a state level, in terms to sort of define how a state might want to engage in those activities and negotiations, it might be a really useful tool, because I'm also not sure that people are really aware of, sort of wider society is really aware of why we might be progressing certain industries, or whether the why or whether it's appropriate has actually been a question that's been answered by society. I'm not sure it has. I think perhaps these initiatives are just being chased, and I'm sure there's lots of reading out there and literature on that we could all delve into. So I don't know if anyone else has anything that they'd like to summarize or touch on before I possibly draw us to a close. But Michelle?
Oh, and it's only a quick one to say, I've actually really enjoyed it. I didn't quite know how it was going to go, but I think just having this conversation with all of us and the input from the attendees, it's just been really nice, and it's a good thing to sometimes stop and just think about what you think in terms of all these big points and big problems. And so thanks for letting me be involved.
Oh, thanks. Well, thanks for joining us, Michelle, and thanks for Denning for prompting this initiative. I think for us, it's something, I'll probably just reiterate, is that inclusion and participation is something that I suppose we all think about in terms of our work, but it's also from the perspective of some of us are just trying to create the kind of ecological basis and the ecological monitoring, and we're very aware that in creating that it's not always an inclusive process. So I think it's something that we wanted to reflect on today as well. How do we start to think about these questions? Because we do, and I think, particularly our work in the One Ocean Hub has made us very, very aware that actually inclusion starts at all levels, and it needs to be considered at all stages in the development of marine spatial planning legislation, marine spatial planning, processes, plans, tentative marine spatial planning that Kirsty and I are working on in ABNJ. But yeah, it's really nice to think about what that might mean for our work, and also for marine spatial planning globally, as it becomes very likely more important for many of us here. So thanks everyone. Denning, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to sum up?
Not much. I'll just say thanks to every one of you for your involvement. Thanks to everyone who took the time to be with us to hear us exchange our views on these issues. And this is a significant aspect for Africa as a whole. You know, it's very important for Africa. We want to see more people involved in conversations and research related to the marine environment. And I look forward to more of these engagements and actual developments to see comprehensive inclusion of all stakeholders, and especially the local communities in the development of marine areas within South Africa and Africa as a whole, and eventually APNG. Thank you.
Eventually. It's happening, Teddy. And Kirsty, I don't know if you have any last minute thoughts you want to say.
I don't have anything to add, just to say that it's been really, really interesting, really thought-provoking. And it's just nice to have these just much broader discussions. You get very stuck in your silo of what you're doing on day to day, and it's really nice and interesting to think about how it fits into the broader context and how we can improve what we're doing.